Well, we're in our final episode of the Allocation series, and in this episode, we're going to pull everything together and help you understand when to use each of the tools that we've covered in our past episodes. So just as a recap, we've covered 4 heart postures and their accompanying structures to help us answer the question, how much should I give and how much should I keep? We talked about the posture of response and how spontaneous giving helps us build responsiveness. Then we talked about how percentage giving can help us adopt a posture of surrender. Next, we talked about giving goals and how they help us build a sense of adventure. And finally, we talked about finish lines and how they help us with eternal alignment.
Now, each of these 4 structures helps to build these heart postures into our spiritual formation. But there's also a little bit more to the timing about when each of these might be most impactful in our spiritual lives. And it actually has most to do with your financial stability or kind of your financial stage of life. So we break down financial stability into 5 major stages. The first is struggling, where often it's difficult to make ends meet. Maybe things are frequently falling through the cracks. The second stage is surviving, where you feel like you're just keeping your head above water. Maybe you feel like you're living paycheck to paycheck, just making it through. The third is stable, consistently covering expenses, but without a lot of margin for financial growth. The fourth stage is secure, with steady savings towards long-term goals and progressive financial growth. And then finally, the fifth stage is surplus, where there is routinely more than is needed to cover expenses and long-term savings goals. Now, not everybody may go through all 5 of these stages, and movement isn't always linear. You may move forward for a period and then maybe move back for a period as circumstances change. But understanding the current stage that you're at can help you engage with these 4 allocation structures that we've talked through. Now, the first of our 4 structures is spontaneous giving. One of the major differences between spontaneous giving and the other allocation structures that we've talked about is that it defaults to not giving until the right circumstances arise. And that can be a challenge as we try to remain engaged in giving and generosity with God constantly stretching us over the long haul. It's just easy for the regular flow of life to distract us from giving altogether. And when spontaneous giving is the only structure that we use, then we will find that our giving can often be pretty intermittent, with mountaintop experiences followed by long gaps or valleys in between. That's certainly not always the case, but that is one risk or challenge that comes when spontaneous giving is our only structure of giving. And that's true across all 5 financial stages. Where we're going to see spontaneous giving really shine is when we add it to other structures that we might already have in our lives. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes.
Our second structure, percentage giving, has the most dramatic effect on us in the early stages of struggling and surviving. And that's for a couple reasons. First is because we personally feel the impact of our giving. When we are struggling or surviving financially, there are generally lots of priorities competing for our resources, and to give anything at all may be sacrificial at this stage. When we commit to giving in good times and bad, it is a powerful expression of faith and it grows us as givers.
Some of the most powerful percentage giving stories that I've heard over the years have all been when people were in some of their most challenging financial circumstances. Even if they were often not in a challenging state of financial circumstances, if they found themselves even temporarily in that state, that's when the powerful stories of faith and provision where God came through in truly miraculous ways. I think about one story of a giver who decided for the first time to do a 10% tithe. And right before they were going to write that first check, some of their income for the month fell through. and they weren't even sure how they were going to make ends meet. But they felt passionate and convicted about making this commitment because they really wanted to honor it and wrote that check anyway, even though they had no idea how things were going to work out. And they talked about how, for the first time in their memory, they were not sure how they were going to have food to put on the table for the family that week. And just a couple days after that, a completely random family from their church showed up at their front door with like 10 or 15 bags of groceries and said, "Hey, every week we buy these groceries and we just ask God to show us a family that we should bring them to. And He told us that we should bring them here." You can be sure that giver never forgot about that experience of giving. And that's where percentage giving is so powerful.
I find that the times that we truly need God's provision and then see him follow through in creative and beautiful ways are the moments that build our faith most strongly and transform our hearts.
Now, one of the challenges with percentage giving is that as financial capacity increases, especially into the secure or surplus zones, that it begins to be difficult to feel that same stretch like you did in the beginning. And so givers will try to compensate for that in different ways by trying to incrementally stretch that percentage each year or trying to pick significantly higher percentages, maybe 50% or 90% for some givers. But it can start to feel difficult to reliably trust in God in the same way that we're required to in those struggling and surviving stages. And a lot of givers don't know of any other structure for giving other than percentage giving. I'd say in the general American church, that's really one of the few styles of giving that is ever talked about. But that's where some of the other structures can be really helpful as we move into that secure and surplus zone.
Now, our third structure, which is giving goals, can actually be a stretch for anyone at any point in their journey. Giving goals help us experience adventure in our giving because when used properly, we are setting goals that we may not have a clear plan for achieving on our own. And these experiences lead to some of the most inspiring stories of how God shows up in miraculous ways.
Yeah, I think one of the cool features about giving goals is that it is so easily customizable to whatever financial stage you're in, whether you are just barely making ends meet or whether you have multiple times what you could ever possibly need to spend on yourself. You can set a giving goal that is a stretch where you just don't know how it will all come together. And that is what brings out the adventure in it, is by asking God to move. Now, both percentage giving and giving goals work well to bring out this provision from God and to see that happen in real time. I think where some of the difference is that with percentage giving, God's often providing to help us make ends meet once we have let go of whatever we have committed to. With a giving goal, I think where we really see that kind of miraculous intervention is in God helping us to meet that goal or in God allowing us to be a part of something. And so it's kind of on two ends of the spectrum that we get to see God at work, both in powerful ways. But that's why I think percentage giving is so powerful in those earlier stages, whereas giving goals can be pretty powerful at most stages.
I find that in seasons where I don't feel like I'm being stretched by my giving, it's become something I've gotten used to. Setting a giving goal can help me to reprioritize my own spending and savings and giving strategy.
And that brings us to our final structure, which is financial finish lines. Now, finish lines help us to align ourselves with eternal priorities. But once we start to move into the secure and surplus phases, a finish line is going to have a much greater effect on how we actually answer the questions. How much do I keep? How much do I give? And somewhat radically change our financial mindset altogether. Now, in the in between zone, in the stable phase, it can be actually pretty helpful to set a finish line around that time before a season of surplus down the line, because it's going to be much easier to make that commitment to a finish line when you're already used to living on a certain lifestyle. Then, as capacity continues to increase, it's much easier to maintain.
Now, you'll know your situation better than anyone else, but at any level of financial stability, it's helpful to evaluate which of these four structures is going to work best for you in a way that's actually stretching your faith.
I think that's an important point because in this whole conversation, we're not really talking about what somebody should do. What we're really trying to get at is what is going to most engage our faith at each of these five levels of financial stability. The goal in the end is for our giving to draw us into deeper relationship with God. And I think it's easy to fall into a rhythm of using the same structure for our giving for a long time, even as our financial status changes. That's where a lot of this discussion becomes most helpful, is in figuring out what's really going to engage me most deeply throughout my financial life. So, summarizing our four structures across all five stages of financial stability, when we look at the struggling phase, where it is very hard to make ends meet, percentage giving is going to be very engaging in our faith, right? This is where I think of the widow's mite dropping her last two coins and Jesus pointing her out to the rest of the disciples. Now, giving goals can be pretty engaging too. They don't come with quite the same consistency over the long haul that percentage giving does, but can still be very challenging on a faith level. Finish lines are probably not going to be very helpful at this stage. As we move on to surviving, a lot of the same points are true, but then as we move on to the stable phase, percentage giving is going to begin to feel a little easier, a little more comfortable, as there's a little bit more reliability to income covering expenses, a little more consistency. Giving goals can be very powerful at this stage, where they can still be quite a stretch. And finish lines can begin to be a part of the conversation. Again, this is a good time to start thinking about setting maybe a future oriented finish line that you have not reached yet, but knowing where you would say enough is, especially from an income standpoint. This is how much would be enough that I would not have to use any more than that. Once we move on to secure, percentage giving can begin to feel a little more easy, whereas finish lines can start to become a little more relevant in terms of beginning to cross that threshold if you have capped your income at a certain level. And then finally, in the surplus zone, it's often difficult to feel that stretch of faith with percentage giving. Giving goals can be particularly powerful. This is the stage where finish lines are going to really thrive in engaging faith through complete alignment of the financial picture. And so you can see as we move through the five stages, different structures begin to become more or less relevant, especially in terms of how they engage us at our core and how they engage our spiritual journey alongside.
Now, one other note I'd like to make that I actually discovered in my own experience is these allocation structures can often be combined in a way where they work together to help build us as givers. I started as a spontaneous giver and then moved into a percentage structure. And finally, I set a finish line and thought that I didn't need any other structures. And a couple years later, I set a giving goal, even though I already had a spending finish line in place. And it truly did take my wife and I on an adventure for the rest of that year while we worked towards this goal together. And as a result of that experience, I realized that incorporating spontaneous giving at every stage in the game helps us stay responsive and listening to the Holy Spirit. Percentage giving often serves as a very helpful floor for our giving. Giving goals can get us out of our comfort zone, and finish lines help us put a ceiling on our spending. And so, any phase of life that you're in, any level of financial stability, you can combine these different structures to help you achieve those exact results that I just described.
In my own life, and for a number of givers that we've talked to, I think another common combination is the combination of a finish line with a percentage giving. That can happen both on the lower capacity side. If you set maybe a future oriented finish line that you have not quite reached yet, the percentage gives you that baseline of giving. I will always give 10%, or I will always give 15%, or whatever your threshold is. But then once you reach that finish line, you say, I'm going to give everything over that. And so when the capacity is lower, the percentage kicks in. And when capacity increases, that finish line protects you from lifestyle expansion or lifestyle creep. As we went through the 5 stages, you'll notice I didn't mention spontaneous giving as being the strongest in engaging our faith at any of those. I actually think it's very powerful as a secondary or add-on structure to any of the other structures. So if you have a regular percentage that you use, and then suddenly some opportunity comes up, or maybe you have some kind of a windfall, and you feel suddenly led to give well beyond your percentage in that moment, that is a beautiful response to the Holy Spirit, even though you already had a giving percentage in place. Or maybe you have a finish line and you have been consistently giving according to that finish line, but then some event or opportunity happens and you decide, we're going to live on even less than our finish line this year because we want to be a part of this giving opportunity, or we want to give in this way. And again, that's a beautiful response to the Spirit. And then, as we talked about earlier in this series, spontaneous giving also shows up in many other ways within these other structures through how much we might give to individual giving opportunities from the amount that we've set aside from a percentage or a finish line, or maybe through the timing of our giving. So even if we're setting aside a percentage amount each month, or we're setting aside according to a finish line, deciding to spontaneously give that amount that's set aside is another way to incorporate the responsiveness to the Spirit. So you can see all of these can overlap in many beautiful ways. I think what's most helpful is to understand the strengths and weaknesses of each of these structures in each of the different contexts that they can be used, and to figure out what's my one next step right now. What structure am I using currently? Is there some step I can take either by adjusting or moving the structure I'm already using, or maybe by adding a second to it, or maybe by switching to a whole different structure altogether to better engage my faith through my financial situation, regardless of what level of financial stability you're at right now.
This concludes our series on the allocation dimension. Up next, we're going to kick off our series on flow. Stay tuned.